North East England, the Five Frontiers. Frontier 1, the River Tees. Part 2, Bloodaxe versus Bamburgh on Route 66. Written and narrated by David Simpson. englandsnortheast.co.uk. In the first part of our visit to the frontier of the Tees, we saw how the valley once served as the Scottish border and, more significantly, formed a northern perimeter for the Norsemen in eastern England, inspiring the Scottish poet Sir Walter Scott in verses of his Teesdale-themed poem Rokeby. Sticking firmly to his Norse god theme in Rokeby, Sir Walter Scott couldn't resist a mention of the Thorsgill Beck near Barnard Castle, where those Vikings remembered Thor's victorious fame and gave the dell the Thunderer's name. But perhaps the real story of the part the Tees played as a Viking frontier begins to unfold on wild Stainmore, the Stainmore Gap, where the rocky River Greta rises in the bleak moorlands between the Tees and the Arkle Beck of Arkengarthdale, a tributary of the Swale. The Stainmore Gap is a Pennine pass that plays host to the A66, a busy yet remote thoroughfare that is so often the first to succumb to snow closures in England's bleakest winters. This gap is an ancient routeway, but also a formidable frontier. Close to the busy road stands the stump of the ancient Rye Cross near the Cumbria-Durham border. The word Rye or Ray comes from the Old Norse for a boundary, and it surprisingly marks an ancient border between the kingdoms of Northumbria and Strathclyde. It is a reminder of the complex medieval history of both Cumberland and northeastern England in times past. King Eric was treacherously killed in a certain lonely place which is called Stainmore, with his son Heric and his brother Ragnald, betrayed by Earl Oswulf. The words were written by a scribe at St. Peter's in York in the 10th century. It was on Stainmore in AD 954 that the Norse king of Northumbria, Eric Bloodaxe, met his tragic end, and the cross is said to mark the point of his demise and the beginning of his journey into Valhalla. Some commentators have lamented Eric's death as the final chapter in the Northumbrian kingdom's independence, but the story is perhaps more complex than that, and even contradictory to the notion. Bloodaxe, who earned his gruesome name from his fearsome reputation on the battlefield, was a king of Norway, whose bloody legacy was sealed in the Norse Fagriskina and Eriksmal sagas. Leaving Norway, he became king of Northumbria from AD 947 to AD 948, and again from 952 to 954, his reign interrupted by Olaf Sihtricsson, a Norseman of Dublin, during the complex political events of the era. In truth, any Viking described as King of Northumbria might be better remembered as a King of York, being effectively the ruler of Yorkshire and the Viking-settled satellite regions to the west of the Pennines. Norse kings of Northumbria, such as Bloodaxe, were based in York and sometimes in Dublin. They may have been accepted as kings with a token homage from the leaders of the northeast to the north of the Tees, but in truth the real rulers of that particular region, which then stretched to the Firth of Forth, were the Anglian High Reeves or Earls of Bamburgh, who ruled as virtual kings over all the lands north of the Tees. Irish historians of the time referred to these men as the kings of the North Saxons. Bloodaxe met his end in an ambush as he journeyed across the Pennines, and he fell at the hands of Maccus, who was working as an agent of Oswulf, the High Reeve of Bamburgh, who was in turn working in alliance with the King of Wessex. This supposed treachery demonstrates the complexity of the politics of the period and the unhelpful nature of the term Northumbria in describing the supposedly unified, wider kingdom of the era. In reality, there had always been a great divide within Northumbria, the kingdom north of the Humber, even in Anglo-Saxon times. There was an ever-present and often bloody rivalry between the earlier kingdoms of Durham and Bernicia, which met at the Tees, but they had nevertheless merged from north to south to form Northumbria. Some of the major flashpoints in this Northumbrian civil war took place in and around the Tees Valley, most notably at Kinningscliff, the King's Cliff near Darlington, that was later renamed Coniscliff by the Vikings. Here the church is intriguingly dedicated to Edwin, a powerful Durham king of all Northumbria in much earlier times. During the Northumbrian troubles, Oswin, a Bernician earl, was murdered by King Athelwold Moll of Catterick at Coniscliff in AD 761, and 13 years later another noble called Alfwold seized the throne after a murderous coup at Coniscliff. In the unstable late Anglo-Saxon period, from AD 700 to AD 867, there was a succession of 25 Northumbrian kings, of whom 3 were murdered, 5 slain in battle, 2 abdicated, and 9 were forcibly driven out of office. These troubled times weakened the kingdom of Northumbria and exposed the rich agricultural lands in the southerly half of the kingdom to the huge invasion of the Danes in AD 866. This saw the establishment of the Viking colonisation of Northumbria's southern capital, which became the Viking city of Jorvik, and the subsequent division of its great earldom or shire into 3 Viking political divisions called Thrythinga, Thryding, a third part, which we know today as the Yorkshire Ridings. So it was upon Durham that the Viking settlement largely fell, resulting in the formation of the Kingdom of York. Viking settlement in western Yorkshire, Cumberland, Westmoreland and parts of Lancashire would follow, with those later settlements west of the Pennines often associated with the Hiberno-Norse or Norse Gael Vikings, who had colonised Dublin, parts of Ireland, the Isle of Man and many of the Scottish islands, speaking Gaelic or Gaelic as fluently as they spoke Old Norse. Just to the north of the River Tees, in what was developing into County Durham, the Vikings were no strangers, but the settlements there seem to have been very much on the frontier of Viking influence and never as densely distributed as they were to the south of the river. In AD 918, much of the Durham coast from Billingham to the mouth of the River Wear was divided and settled between the Viking warlords Skula and Olaf Ball in a gift from the Hiberno-Norse king Ragnald of York and Dublin, following a great battle at Corbridge on the Tyne. Castle Eden Dean seems to have been a dividing line between the estates of the two Norsemen. This seizure of land caused much consternation for the predecessors of the Bishop of Durham at Conecaster, or Chesterley Street as we know it today, who protested that this annexed territory was sacredly St. Cuthbert's land, though the annexation would prove to be temporary. Later, Settlements and Viking territorial estates immediately north of the Tees seem to have been steadily returned to the powerful bishops north of the Tees, perhaps through coercion, or maybe from a genuine desire of the increasingly Christianized Norse landowners to gain favour in the afterlife. Yet it began with a grant from a Saxon, the England and Wessex king Athelstan, who returned his beloved vill of Wearmouth, the coastal lands south of the River Wear, to St Cuthbert's territory. These are likely the former lands of Olaf Ball, reclaimed by Athelstan. This gift was followed in the period 990 to 1018 with gifts of land at Darlington, at Sedgefield, Gainford-on-Tees, Sockburn-on-Tees, Norton-on-Tees, and even Aucklandshire on the Wear. The donators of these lands had curiously Norse-sounding names like Styr, Snakulf, Ulfsitel, and Northman. One of the final grants of land that again probably signified a return of Viking-seized lands to St Cuthbert was the territory of Staindropshire, granted by no less a man than King Cnut, the all-powerful Viking king of Norway, Denmark and England. Cnut is known to have held a manor house in Staindropshire that is thought to have been located in the oldest part of Raby Castle, known today as the Bulmer Tower. Raby is of course yet another Viking place name, though there is some dispute whether the Ray of the name signifies a Viking settlement on a boundary mark, Raby is situated on a Roman road, or derives from an old Anglo-Saxon word for roe deer. Certainly, deer have inhabited the parkland here for more than 1,000 years. Raby is a superb medieval castle that has long dominated the history of Teesdale, especially in the medieval period when it was the historic home of the powerful Neville family. Even today, the tentacles of the Raby estate stretch deep into Teesdale, encompassing the High Force waterfall and traditionally all the white-painted farmhouses that litter the splendid Pennine scenery along the northern bank of the Dale. The connection between Raby and Cnut may have been the beginning of a long association of that great castle with people of power. Indeed, it was here that Cecily Neville, the Rose of Raby, mother to King Edward IV and Richard III, was born, and it was here in 1569 that the rising of the North was plotted in a hopeful allegiance between the Durham Nevilles and the Percy powerhouse of Northumberland. It was a rebellion against Queen Elizabeth I. Now was the North in arms. They shine, in warlike trim from Tweed to Tyne, at Percy's voice. And Neville sees his followers gathering in from Tees, from Wear, and all the little rills, concealed among the forked hills, 700 knights, retainers all, of Neville, at their master's call, had sate together at Raby Hall. These words were composed by the Cumberland poet Wordsworth several centuries later in The White Doe of Rilston. But despite the grandeur of its setting, the rising itself fizzled out into little more than a loss of nerve, but was followed with a brutal retribution on the part of the unforgiving Tudor Queen that saw executions in villages across the length and breadth of the region. It was perhaps this moment, rather than the death of Bloodaxe centuries before, that marked the end of any hope of preserving a northern separateness. The granting or return of Staindropshire to the bishops of Durham by King Cnut had demonstrated a reverential nod of recognition by the Vikings to the power of the cult of St. Cuthbert. This reverence for the great saint had a deep connection to the Northumbrian identity and psyche on both sides of the Tees. Indeed, Cnut's reverence was dramatically demonstrated in his tonsured 6-mile barefoot walk of pilgrimage in 1031 to St. Cuthbert's shrine at Durham. He set out from Garmon's Way, now the site of a deserted medieval village near Coxoe to the south of the city. A story that the king's hair was trimmed before the pilgrimage, monk style, at the aptly named nearby village of Trindon is probably a fanciful yet appealing embellishment. Cnut was not the first formidable Viking king to make a pilgrimage to the great saint's shrine. In AD 952, 2 years before his death, Eric Bloodaxe had peacefully visited St. Cuthbert's earlier resting place at Conecaster, or Chesterley Street as we now call it, nearly 80 years before. Such was the powerful symbolism of the great Northumbrian saint. In the third part of our story of the frontier of the Tees, we visit the Viking settled district of Cleveland and Odin's Hill at Rosebery Topping, along with the Viking wapentake of Sadberge that later merged with County Durham. We investigate the numerous Viking place names of the Tees Valley and the mysterious Viking sculptures called hogbacks that are most commonly found in Allertonshire and the Vale of the Tees.